the Town.
Namaste, I am Sudarshan and welcome to Talk of the Town. Against the backdrop of this discourse related to the investment climate or environment in the country, there have been compelling calls from the private sector on the government asking for a review and amendments to many laws and regulations that would enable DFI investments or to create an environment for investors to have confidence in investing in Nepal. Against this backdrop, I have with me a delegate who is attending the second mission to Nepal by DFIs to understand the Nepalese market and investment opportunities that are in Nepal for DFIs to invest. So let me just introduce the DFI delegate. He is Joram Straven, the Director of Impact at the Dutch Entrepreneurial Development Bank, FMO, who's with us. Thank you very much for giving us your time against the backdrop of the mission that you are engaged in. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Let's start by looking at some figures. Between 2007 and 2023, that's last year, DFIs invested just over $1 billion in Nepal. And of that, 56% accounted for your investments in the financial sector. So against this backdrop, could you explain who are DFIs? What do they do? And in particular, what is their interest in investing in Nepal's financial service sector?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation and I enjoy being here. So development finance institutions, DFIs, we've been set up essentially to foster sustainable local prosperity in the countries where we operate. So to foster economic growth, increases in jobs, reducing inequalities, to help more women find employment, and to do so in a sustainable way. So to ensure that we counter climate change, which I think Nepal is also suffering from quite a lot, as well as protect, for example, biodiversity. So these are some of the impact goals that we have, and we do so by investing typically in the private sector. That's certainly the case for FMO, the Dutch Entrepreneurial Development Bank. So we finance in the private sector in emerging economies only. So we don't actually invest in the Netherlands at all. We only invest in emerging economies.
So you would consider Nepal to be an emerging economy, considering that Nepal is supposed to be graduating from where they are?
Absolutely. So I think both the least developed countries, the middle income countries, we consider emerging economies. And indeed, we're very excited actually that Nepal is on the cusp of graduating from a least developed country to a middle income country. I think that's wonderful news, and we hope to contribute to that development over the coming years.
So the mission to Nepal by development finance institutions, it's really been back to back. You had one last year in 2023 and again this year around the same time. So what were the outcomes that you were able to take from last year's mission, one? And the second is, what are your expectations from this mission, from the mission for 2024?
Right. So maybe a bit of background on last year's mission. So I think quite a lot of preparation went in by essentially three countries, the Dutch, the British, and the Swiss, who collectively set up an initiative to foster more investment in Nepal, and that culminated in last year's mission of DFIs, which was the first one to try and entice our fellow DFIs also into investing more in this country. So I think if we look at last year's mission, it was already quite successful with 8 DFIs attending. and I think a lot of connections were made in the market, and we've seen about 155 million in additional investments in 4 banks that has gone in since that mission, so we're very excited about that. And we thought that it would be good to follow up quickly to see if we could broaden the appeal of investing in Nepal even further. So this year we actually have 14 DFIs and impact investors present. So we think that's a great success, and that was one of the reasons why we thought it made sense to do a quick follow-up, because the needs of Nepal are great, and the opportunities are there also.
Okay. So again, touching upon numbers, like I said, in the last 16 between 2007 to 2023, the investments were just over $1 billion. However, looking at the figures for the last 3 years, those numbers were almost half. That's like $588 million in investments by DFIs in the last 3 years alone. So how do you explain this dramatic increase in investments in the last 3 years?
It's a big question, and I don't actually pretend to have the full answer, because I think it's a complicated one. But I think there's a few factors at play here. So one, I think, is a learning effect. So you see a relatively small group of DFIs doing the majority of those investments, essentially IFC from the World Bank, DFC, the American DFI, and then FMO and BII together. Take FMO, so we came in 2007 originally with an investment in Clean Energy Development Bank, which was subsequently taken over by NMB, so then we were also a shareholder in NMB. And I think it takes time for a DFI to really get to know a country. And because we don't actually provide aid, we don't give money away, we actually invest. So we do need to see that the money goes into a business that we can believe can prosper, and that can ultimately also repay with interest, or if it's an equity stake, it can ultimately thrive, and potentially we can exit at a profit. That's our mission. That's success, right? And success is obviously not limited to financial success. We also like to see that indeed we have generated economic growth, increased jobs, reduced inequalities, and improved sustainability. So I think part of the answer is that if you look at those 4 DFIs as they came in over that period, they needed to get to know the country and have a number of positive experiences on the investment side, which we certainly had. I think an other element is that a country kind of needs to have a certain readiness. And what we've seen over the past few years particularly is that the Nepalese government, the central bank, have developed a constructive attitude to thinking about regulation changes that, as you mentioned at the beginning, are requested by the Nepalese private sector, but also occasionally we will advise changes that could be helpful to bring more investment. One example is in the sphere of the bylaws of the central bank. As I mentioned, we need to have an investment into a company that we can believe to be successful and repay, but typically we will invest in dollars. So if that money needs to be repaid, it needs to be repaid in dollars. So even if the company can repay, the central bank must still allow the money to go outside the country for us to be repaid. So these are some of the areas in which we have seen a constructive attitude, which I think has been very helpful. And we're in active dialogue to help improve things even further, which I think will grow the potential of the country.
So building on what you just said, the positive attitude and initiative by the government, so seeing that particular increase in the last 3 years, like I said, $588 million in investments by the DFI community. So would it be fair to say that the DFIs have confidence in the investment climate and that the experience has been positive?
Yes. So I think the DFIs have confidence, otherwise we would not have invested substantial amounts of that nature. And I think there's potential for more. So if we look at the state of Nepal, we see that there's the promise of economic growth, as you mentioned. Nepal is on the cusp of actually graduating from a least developed country to a middle income country, so that suggests that there's potential for more investment to be done. So we think that if we work together, both with the private sector at the company level, but also with the government for further improvements in the regulatory environment, even more is possible, and I think investor confidence can grow even further.
So for that growth for Nepal to graduate, the SME sectors have a role to play, right? So the Asian Development Bank states that the funding gap resources needed for the SME sector is around $1 billion. And what the ADB says is also that that gap can be filled by DFIs through the investments in the financial sector. So what's your take on this statement by the Asian Development Bank?
I think that the order of magnitude's probably correct. I would guess it could even be larger. I've even heard of UN estimates in the range of 3 billion. So I think the gap is huge. And I do think that DFIs, once an economy is sizable enough, can bring very substantial amounts of finance into a country. I saw a figure of IFC that has more than 4 billion in India alone. And that's one DFI, so I think collectively it should certainly be possible to grow to a 1 billion number over time. At the same time, I think that will also require development of the local financial sector to be able to absorb these kinds of money, and again on the regulatory change side of things. An interesting example is if you look at interest rate caps, for example. So I think these are deemed helpful to protect SMEs from paying too much, and I think that is absolutely an important consideration that we also always look at when we do our financing. At the same time, they can also have the impact of actually excluding a certain segment of SMEs, because they incentivize banks to only invest in relatively safe counterparties, because if you have a low interest rate, you don't have any buffer to take any losses. So that might exclude SMEs that, for example, cannot offer collateral as part of the loan. And we see in some other markets that where there is space to quote slightly higher interest rates, not crazy interest rates, because the company does need to be able to pay them from its cash flow, but somewhat higher rates, that can open up types of finance to SMEs that may struggle to put up collateral, for example. So that's an area that will be interesting to explore if we want to get to the 1 billion figure over time.
So DFI investments are kind of integrally linked to the environment, social dimension, and also the governance outcomes. So could you, in a way, decode these three aspects that are relevant to Nepalese businesses and the economy as a whole, for people to understand this, the ESG component linked to DFIs, and especially for SMEs?
Right. So I mentioned that we have a kind of impact goal to help reduce inequalities, so that finance, for example, goes to SMEs who struggle to have access to finance, or to women who have difficulty obtaining finance as entrepreneurs, and also to causes that connect to fighting climate change, mitigation efforts, etc., clean energy. At the same time, we also find that as you engage in projects, there are very specific measures that need to be taken to make sure that the project actually doesn't cause active harm. And particularly our ESG standards are aimed to prevent that. So I think well known to most, you've got your classic health and safety standards. How do you make sure that your employees don't get electrocuted when they're working on a power line, these kind of things. But our standards go quite a lot further than that. We want to make sure that land rights are respected of people who may currently be living on the property of a new project that's going to be developed. We'd like to see that biodiversity is not being harmed, cultural sites are respected, etc. So our ESG standards are quite extensive, informed by the IFC performance standards, which are made by the World Bank, as well as, of course, local regulations. So we work very intensively with our clients together to make sure that these risks are managed well.
So, I mean, as an investor, as a DFI investments, how do you kind of monitor the adherence to these standards or improvement of these standards? How do you kind of look into, I mean, the first aspect is the preconditions.
Correct.
But then there's also the implementation part of it. So as a DFI, how do you look into these standards?
So we tend to have a differentiated approach. So, for example, in the space of SME finance, we rely largely on local law and local regulation. These are typically small businesses, as well as the financial intermediary, which may be the bank that we're financing, to make sure that these standards are adhered to. If you take a very complicated and large development like a hydropower plant, for example, that's a very different story. There we really need to go in ourselves. We will send our own specialists. We will assess the site, all of the potential challenges that may be there, from indigenous species of fish to the land issues, etc. And we'll look at what needs to happen there to make sure that the project adheres to international standards. Then we will tend to employ consultants, ideally local if available, and that's one area in Nepal where we're also working to improve the capacity of local consultants to help us with these projects, and they then help us on a more frequent basis to monitor the project. And of course we'll do our own site monitoring visits as well.
So I mean, as a community, what are DFIs doing to upgrade the human resources development of the financial sector in terms of ESG?
Right, so we have a number of initiatives going. So we work actually with the financial sector together to look at what the standards need to be. Then we will send our specialists to, for example, the bank, and typically we'll request them to also hire environmental and social expertise into the bank, which we will then help and support. And like I said, we will also look at programs where potentially you can build up local consultancy capacity so that there's support for the more complicated projects.
I mean, I understand that that there is some partnership between the Nepal Bankers Association and the Barcelona School of Management trying to build the capacity, the human resources in the ESG. Can you just kind of briefly explain that initiative and how that kind of translates to the technical inputs that DFIs bring into the country?
So I think it's a good example of where we try to approach things not only at the individual client level, but also at the sector level. So typically if only one bank starts to raise ESG standards, you lose a level playing field and you get problems. So if we do it collectively, we can gradually bring up the whole sector that way. So that's why we enjoy working with the local kind of bankers association, which can kind of represent the sector and also help the sector grow as a whole. And then you bring in technical parties with the requisite knowledge and expertise to do the training, etc. So I think it's exactly an example of that kind of work, which we found quite fruitful actually in building these skills, and they're absolutely necessary for banks to be able to take these larger volumes of DFI money that you were referring to earlier, because it means that all the other DFIs need to feel comfortable that the standards can be implemented. So
DFIs, I understand DFIs don't have a physical presence in Nepal, other than the British International Investment.
Correct, they do.
BI being an exception, how do you access market intelligence, market opportunities, also maybe the political environment in the country to make that in the decision-making process? How do you access that kind of information?
Right. So I guess we employ a combination of strategies there. So each DFI will have their own staff who will travel frequently to Nepal, and there'll be sector-specific staff, so they'll really try to understand the sector they're investing in. So FMO is particularly investing in financial institutions, hydro, and private equity. So that's the first layer. Then we act as a community. So we will typically also end up visiting, for example, our fellow DFIs, in this case BII, to learn from them, because they're actually in country, and that's how we work in other countries too. So you visit each other's offices to share the knowledge there. We make good use of our embassies because they obviously also bring intelligence. And then we have built up this joint initiative with IIN, who are also, of course, preparing these DFI missions for us, and they play another role in actually developing both intelligence information and then also connections locally with potential counterparties for investment.
Yeah, and specifically with IIN, how do you assess the role that IIN should be playing or has been playing to act as that facilitator between DFIs and investment ecosystem stakeholders, that bridge between the two?
So I think they've played a very constructive role there, actually. So we're very excited with the success, as I mentioned, of last year's mission, which they helped prepare. I think they're also blending in a lot of local knowledge in their work, and they're able to, also because we essentially share the cost between the DFIs, and kind of pooling that resource of going to speak to quite a lot of potential counterparties, kind of getting a first impression of the suitability for DFI investment, and down the line maybe also helping in certain aspects to prepare them for that investment later on. So it's both at the individual counterparty level that they can support, but also just in the sense of convening, knowing which parties to reach out to, and making sure that key people like the central bank governor, like the Secretary of Finance, who was here today, which we're very grateful for, that they actually come and meet, and that we can converse together on how to invest more in Nepal.
Yeah, talking about government representatives' presence, the governor, the secretary from the Ministry of Finance, what do you believe could be initiatives that the government of Nepal would be taking to improve the investment climate, in particular for DFIs in the coming days?
The coming days sounds very ambitious, because these changes typically do take a bit of time, but I think for starts, I mean, the fact that they're available to speak to us and to exchange perspectives and views is in itself already very helpful. It shows that the government has an ear for international investment, is listening constructively. So I think that in itself already actually helps in building investor confidence. And then beyond that, as we've already seen over the past few years, if there's a constructive dialogue where changes can be made to make the investments easier to get into the country, and also when they're successful, easier to get out of the country, these can help to bring more money in ultimately.
So in that context, developments that have taken place over the past couple of months, you had that understanding with the government, you had that understanding with the government of Nepal, where you signed a memorandum of understanding, where the government kind of recognized your role as a facilitator in Nepal's development through investments that you bring in. And again, following that was the change in the bylaws by the central bank that recognizes you as a financial institution, as an investor. So does that kind of help in bridging that gap or bridging that relationship that you have with the government?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think they're very helpful steps. So I think it's an example of trust of the government of Nepal in the DFIs. I I think it takes some time to kind of get a good feel for what we're able to bring to the table. And indeed, that our primary interest is actually the well-being of Nepal and to help the country grow and prosper. That's our mandate. That's why we were set up. And I think that MOU recognizes essentially that is our function, and vice versa, that the government of Nepal is open to listen and to help us do our job even better, definitely is helpful.
What about your confidence in the Nepalese private sector, in particular the financial sector, where you are able to partner and meet your objectives of bringing impact through your investments?
So I think there's a lot of potential there.
Based on your experience so far?
Yes, so I think there's a lot of potential there. And in our experience in markets that don't have a long history of large volumes of foreign direct investment, and as you mentioned, it's in the last few years that foreign direct investment has really shot up. There's typically still quite a lot of work to be done at the company level to help the company be ready for a foreign investor like a DFI. If you look at NMB Bank, with whom we've had a very long and fruitful relationship, you see they've come a very long way along that curve, and I think they're a very good example of the potential of the Nepalese private sector. That when you work with DFIs over such a period, you're really ready to take sizable investment from multiple DFIs. So I think that's a very exciting example of what's possible.
So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
The recognition by the government of Nepal of DFIs as partners in Nepal's development, and recent changes made to the bylaw by the Central Bank of Nepal recognizing DFIs as investors in Nepal's development sector is a positive initiative. When we talk about DFI investments, now we understand that they are inherently linked to ESG. When we talk of DFIs, the inherent keywords we now know are impact investment and risk capital linked to Nepal's sustainable development goals, economic growth, the environment, social dimension, and governance dimension to investments in Nepal. Thank you.
Talk of the Town.